Did you know in the early 1930s, nearly 4 million Ukrainians were wiped off the face of this earth? Entire towns disappeared, and the media would cover it up for years before brave journalists uncovered the truth. This is the history of the Holodomor. Hey guys, and welcome back to Undoctrination. I'm Maggie.
And I'm Olivia.
And this week we are discussing one of the worst genocides in recent history that you were not taught in schools. We have a very special guest today. This is Ben. Ben, say hi. And we are welcoming both Olivia and Ben into the studio in Atlanta today. I'm very excited. We wanted to have Ben on today because he actually is very well-versed in the history of the Holodomor and also a lot of the misinformation that gets spread around online about it. It is a topic that has a lot of debate and questions surrounding it. So Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history online and also with this topic?
Yes, I've been making TikToks for a couple of years now, mostly on economics and libertarian-related topics. And I came across these Marxist-Leninists, or as we call them, tankies, and they often talked about how much they love the Soviet Union and Stalin and China and Mao, and they would bring up all these little niche facts, and a lot of people didn't really know a lot about the Soviet Union or these other countries that they talked about, and so they didn't really know how to respond. So what I wanted to do is know more about these countries than the proponents do. And so I started doing a lot of reading into the Soviet Union and the Holodomor and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, and if you could give us like a 1-minute synopsis of what the Holodomor is, what would that be?
So basically you had the Soviet famine going on, largely caused by the collectivization that Stalin implemented. And so collectivization resulted in huge drops in agricultural productivity, so people weren't being fed. People starved all over the Soviet Union, but about 40% of the deaths happened in Ukraine specifically. And Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. That's where a lot of the agricultural production was happening, so it's kind of crazy that so many deaths would happen in the place with the most food. And it happened that way because Stalin specifically, and many other people in his government, were worried that the Ukrainians would want independence and might rise up against the Soviet Union.
And I personally had never heard of this in schools. I feel like I was one of the most attentive students in all of my history classes, but this topic never really came up for me. Olivia, did it ever?
No, you're right.
Yeah.
And I was an attentive student too, and I was really obsessed with social studies and history, and I paid attention, and it was never mentioned. I was a political science major in college, never mentioned. In fact, when I first started to research it, I was kind of hit, especially on social media, going through like Twitter and seeing what people were saying on there. I was hit with a lot of comments with, I believe to be misconceptions about what happened, and I was actually wondering, to you, Ben, what are some of the narratives that you see from these tankies or Marxist-Leninists on TikTok? Like, what are the lies that they say about it?
Well, there's different levels. Some people will say nothing happened. And then it's kind of hard to defend. Some of them will say Stalin didn't do anything wrong at all. Maybe it did happen, but he didn't do anything wrong. And some of them will say, well, there was a famine, but there was nothing intentionally done against the Ukrainians. So let's say Stalin didn't actually implement any anti-Ukraine policies.
Why don't we in society view these people the same as we might view a Holocaust denier or an anti-Semite? Like, why are these people so out there in the open with these beliefs?
I think it's mainly due to less people knowing about the Holodomor compared to like the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I don't want to like compare the two. The genocide shouldn't really be compared, but they are both clearly horrific. And the Holodomor specifically, it's starvation deaths, which is one of the most horrific ways you can die. So it's kind of crazy that a lot of people don't know about it. But it really didn't become more widespread, which still it's not quite widespread enough, but didn't become more widespread until the 80s. So the Holocaust, we knew about that as it was going on all the way back in the 40s.
Yeah, and it's a very small number of countries that have actually recognized the Holodomor as a genocide to this day, which is kind of mind-blowing. But this happened in the early 1930s, right? And there was probably over a decade of history of the USSR leading up to that. So what do you think were the main precursors? Like, what exactly led to the starvation and deaths of 7 million plus people?
Yeah, so the Soviets always had a history of being worried about the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians were a very nationalistic people. And they really did not want to be involved, many of them at least, did not want to be involved in the Soviet Union. It was a very religious country especially, and I think that might have something to do with it. The very religious people were more against communism.
Right.
And so there was a bit of a history there. With Lenin, he implemented policies that were to say, well, you can secede from the Soviet Union. And he was going to allow countries like Ukraine to be able to secede, to kind of give an illusion of freedom. But then he didn't realize, they might actually try to secede, and they did want to secede. So then they implemented something else that was sort of like prioritizing the proletariat. So it's like, even if your nation wants to secede, we're in charge of representing the proletariat, and we can say the proletariat don't want to secede.
So what exactly is the proletariat as defined by Lenin?
Yeah, so the proletariat essentially are people who don't own capital. They work for someone else instead of employing other people.
I see a lot of parallels between that and what's going on with workers' movements and socialist and communist movements across the United States today, and how it's very much pitted as us against them. And in race as well, I'm assuming that Ukraine in the 1930s didn't have these racial diversity and ethnic conflicts like that, but more class. And I see that there is, I guess this is why they're obsessed with intersectionality, because now they have two lenses to put us through, maybe even three. There's religion, nationality, race, and the class thing. And so I see a lot of, I don't know if we're in the run-up to something that horrible, but I feel like they're trying to create a class war similar or not unlike that.
Yeah, right? Because this us versus them, when it's divided among class, the them is still your fellow citizens. Like, those are your neighbors, essentially. And when you get into an us versus them mindset, it's very easy to dehumanize the them, right? And that's always beneficial to a state power because they can take more control. Like, I feel like I've noticed that so much.
That's kind of why I wanted to talk about this, because I feel like we're so on the verge of, I'm not saying we're going to starve 7 million people out right now, but I'm saying these are the stepping stones before. I don't think a national divorce is out of the question. I don't think a civil war is out of the question at this point. I think that the divisive nature and hyperpolarization of our country is almost at a breaking point. And for it to be targeted towards people who create and invent and employ, I think is very interesting, to say the least.
Right. And, they targeted Ukrainians because they were, what was it, kulaks? So landowners that were creating
one thing. Yeah, there was a lot of kulaks in Ukraine because, like I said, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Right. So there was many millions of kulaks.
So the bad
targeted
people,
kulaks all over the place.
Yeah, the bad people are the ones that are providing food to everyone.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, basically.
Wow.
Yeah, and really what you're talking about, the conflict, that's really what Marxism is all about. It's all about what they call dialectics. And it's mostly, in the economic sense, it's the conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. They say there's contradictions, and the contradictions have to be rectified, and eventually you're going to get to a society without these contradictions. So you had feudalism, and they're saying it's a contradiction between the serfs and the feudal lords, slavery, contradiction between the masters and the slaves, and then you get to capitalism, and then socialism, and then communism abolishes that sort of relationship.
Wow.
It's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
So those contradictions have to be sorted out. Is that why communists tend to justify mass murder and violence against people?
Yeah, it's kind of an ends justify the means sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah, that's
I was just going to say, to me, it's interesting how, like you just said, there's master and slave. There's all these contradictions between all these different systems of oppression that we've had throughout human history. But it seems like they want to stray away from what is most natural and most fair, which is respecting people's property rights and trading for goods and services or with currency, as is kind of the laws of nature, as we see people or animals in the animal kingdom kind of doing with their, I would say, like, resources. And I was just wondering to you, I guess, when you read the TikTok comments or when you see these TikTokers arguing for this redistribution of wealth or fighting the bourgeoisie, what do you think is going through their heads? Because I am kind of baffled by it. I used to be kind of like a SJW back in the day on my Tumblr days, but I was never a communist.
Yeah,
I never saw the appeal, and it always seemed very unnatural to me. Maybe that's the part that they like, is the unnaturalness of it.
Yeah, like they don't necessarily care about human nature in the same way we would, because I think we kind of see human nature as a fixed thing. You know, human nature is human nature. They see human nature as more malleable. Human nature changes with the material conditions. So they want to change the material conditions and then change human nature. And that's one of the reasons that Marxism often leads to totalitarianism. You're trying to shift the social structure, shift human nature with centralized power. And like what you're talking about, the people in the TikTok comments, the Marxists, there's different types of people, you know, like some of them, they're just kind of in it.
A lot of them have to be kids, right? Like a lot of them have to be teenagers who just aren't educated on this subject.
Kids tend to be very idealistic.
Yeah.
Like,
no,
I will give them a break.
Nobody pull up my old Tumblr post, because I was probably one of them kids. But I was just wondering, because it's very interesting, because the reason that I see a lot of them complain about capitalism is, well, human nature is so greedy, they just want to control the money. A capitalist can never have the benefits of human nature in their mind. That's why they need regulations, that's why they need taxation, that's why they need to redistribute their wealth. But the cognitive dissonance when it comes to a centrally planned government and a centrally planned economy acting like absolute power suddenly does not corrupt absolutely when it just happens to be someone that they like or somebody on their side. And that's when they come to that conclusion, oh, well, it's never been done properly before. It was totalitarian before. Oh, they were just actually secret capitalists. Like, how do they connect that in
Somehow
their
we're going to
brain?
find the one completely pure, good human being on this planet to run our communist utopia, I guess.
Yeah, you've got like the different sects. Some of them will be like, oh, no, we didn't have communism before. We didn't even attempt it. But then, you know, like the tankies, they're the ones who are saying,
there's like the decliners and the
did have
defenders.
communism,
They're like,
and it was
yeah,
great.
we want to do that again.
Gosh.
Don't even get it. They deserved it. That guy, that farmer who owned a cow, he deserved what he got. He was rich.
Yeah. So in doing a little bit of research before this, I saw that the Russian government, as recently as like the late 2010s, they were saying, you know, this wasn't intentional. This happened to lots of different people, not just Ukrainians, and it was more about weather patterns. But there are documents showing that they targeted specific Ukrainian villages. Do you know why they were targeting those specific Ukrainian villages, and exactly what were they doing to cause the mass starvation?
Yeah, like I said, they kind of wanted to target nationalist movements and movements that would be reactionary or counter-revolutionary, anyone who would go against collectivization. And there was especially a lot of opposition to collectivization in Ukraine. So I wouldn't say, like, for the most part they targeted specific villages. It really was primarily directed at Ukraine itself, but there was some of that to an extent. And it's mostly just like, you know, there's more people there we don't like.
Yeah.
That's where, you know, the nationalist movements are stronger. That's where there's more kulaks, or that's where we're getting the most resistance and stuff like that.
So while they're starving these kulaks out, what would they do if somebody tried to like help them or give them food or whatever?
So for a little more context, a kulak is basically, originally it was basically someone who could or was employing someone else, like on their farm, for example. But then that definition like gradually became more broad.
Right.
So now it's, you know, if you don't own a cow, or if you do own your own farm, or
if you own
eventually
anything.
Eventually it was basically if you had anything, if you had a surplus, you're a kulak. And then it was if you sympathize with the kulaks, you're a kulak. And so, yeah, if people wanted to help them, now you're a kulak sympathizer, and yeah, that you're going to get in trouble for that. You could be executed for that. You could go to the gulag for that. You know, there's different stories about you had kulaks, you know, going to markets and trying to get food, and people wouldn't give them food, and then they died there on the spot, and no one would touch them, no one would help them, or even look at them for too long, because they don't want to be accused of being a kulak sympathizer.
I see I'm seeing so many parallels to today when there's this other class of people that we're not supposed to interact with, not supposed to look at. Obviously, we're not actively starving people out right now, but the beginning of the othering of separate classes of people has definitely already started, and I can foresee that something similar happened because nobody wants to be canceled, nobody wants to be associated with certain types of people, and right now I believe it's mainly ideological, but I don't think it's too far from going to class. We're already seeing the middle class shrink and shrink and shrink. We just saw Silicon Valley Bank, the largest bank since Washington Mutual and the second largest bank in U.S. history, collapse. I do believe that the middle class could shrink beyond return, and the divide will only be greater. We will see more people be like, that's the bourgeoisie. And I see these little Twitter kids, the ones that work at Starbucks, which pays for people's college, and they want to unionize and rah, 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 whatever. But they think that the 1% is like people who make $100,000 a year now. Like, they don't even view it as like billionaire business owners. Like, they really think that not even the 1%, just the bourgeoisie is anybody with something. Just like how the kulaks were just people who had employees, maybe had a farm, some animals. That's how it starts. I think that's how it starts.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that the enemy in this sense were the people that were feeding the country through voluntary cooperation with others and voluntary business.
You see all these memes about how, we should separate red states and blue states, and the red states are all going to crumble without the blue states' help. Hello, y'all are going to starve in like approximately 3 business days without red states. They grow all the food.
3 business days. Oh my gosh.
Maybe 4.
So I'm really curious because there is a narrative that has gone around that, there were just bad weather conditions happening. What exact policies were put in place that caused the intentional starvation of Ukrainians?
Yeah, so like I said, kind of the famine was initially started because of collectivization, because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Communism, socialism doesn't work. Right? They had huge drops in agricultural productivity. There certainly were natural forces at play, but that's not unusual, right? I would almost say there's not really such thing as a 100% natural famine because you have natural disasters that happen, but the fact of the matter is that natural disasters keep happening, but there's less famines now because we're able to prepare for famines. We have more efficient agriculture. We have better infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right. So there wasn't any reason why there would be these massive mortalities from a natural famine at this point in Soviet history. They had previous famines, but even the famines that came 50 years prior didn't have even close to the amount of deaths as the Soviet famine in the Holodomor.
Yeah, we're talking 7 million people at least. They also believe that it could be all the way up to 10 million people?
Yeah, it's 7 to 10 million people altogether, and then just
horrifying.
For the Ukrainians, around 3.9.
How did they keep it hidden for so long? Because I know that it basically took journalists and reporters and investigators to kind of expose us to the world, and now even a lot of countries in the world don't even acknowledge that it happened. So, why? Literally, why?
Yeah, it was just really tight in the Soviet Union at this point.
They just kept it quiet?
There was Western journalists in the Soviet Union, but many of them were sympathizers or they were just living lavish lifestyles in Moscow. Some of them were just too ignorant to really see what was going on.
Yeah.
And the ones who did just didn't want to say anything because
they were our ally at the time. Right, we had some kind of investment.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend type of situation.
Yeah, it's they really didn't become our ally per se until World War II. At this point, relationships were pretty shaky. But some of those journalists in Moscow, like Walter Duranty is one of them, he worked for the New York Times. He wrote about a little over a dozen articles in 1931 about the Soviet Union and about Stalin, and that won him the Pulitzer Prize. And these articles and other articles he wrote actually influenced FDR to want to be more friendly with the Soviet Union. And Walter
I'm assuming these were puff pieces.
Yeah.
About the Soviet
Union. Yeah, it was
Union.
collectivization is going so well and stuff like that. Just complete nonsense and fabrications.
It kind of reminds me of the propaganda that Britain put out about the Irish potato famine, because even growing up learning about that in school, they didn't even really talk about how it wasn't just, oh, the potatoes stopped growing. Like, as you said, there are some natural influences and some weather things that happen and some things with the soil, but a lot of it was the British Crown cutting off their food supply. I find it very interesting how this kind of happens through history. A lot of like famines are like actually very motivated by the state.
Yeah, and didn't the government like go into Ukrainian villages and take food away from them and then also like keep them from leaving their towns that were just drying up?
Yeah, so they had what we usually call activists. That's what historians call them, because it wasn't just government officials, but it was, Bolsheviks, and it was communist sympathizers and stuff like that. Sometimes it was just thugs. Sometimes it was soldiers. But yeah, they went into Ukrainian villages. They took food right off your stove, out of your pantry. If you had any surplus, if you're gaining weight, if you're not losing weight, and they're looking at you like, I think you might have a little food
you have a
hidden.
little
Let me
stash
check everywhere.
somewhere.
That happened in The Walking
take
Dead.
all the food.
I remember there was this one guy who was kind of fat, and they like dumped out his stuff. That
Oh
happens.
gosh.
What?
Yeah, if you're in a famine, just remember to lose weight in accordance with everyone else.
Right, be in
Yeah.
there doing your P90X or whatever.
Yeah.
But so we know the kulaks got thrown in the gulags and the sympathizers. Was there anybody else, any groups of people who were thrown in the gulags?
Well, I mean, originally they targeted like the big rich people,
Yeah.
and then so at this point the
Yeah,
kulaks
so you're like
are
Jeff
basically,
Bezos's.
Yeah, like
of
people who own
the
like a lot of
1930s.
land.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, imagine going
This
to the
is-
gulag, you just see like Elon.
Oh no.
This is
What's
like
up, brother?
after a lot of that happened. So
Yeah.
a lot of the kulaks, they're owning land that was basically redistributed to them.
So
from the
now
rich
all
and
of the
Wow.
like super rich people are gone, and now we need to continue to have an enemy,
Yeah.
and so we keep lowering the bar for what that enemy looks
Wow.
like.
Yeah, basically.
So the
yeah.
government is like, here, you poor, here's this farm. And then 5 years later,
They're like, psych.
"Ah, you gotta go to jail.
Something like that. yeah.
Okay, I understand perfectly. I think
Yeah.
I could teach a class on this now.
They also had internal passports, which basically meant you're like restricted to your village
Yeah.
unless you get permission, which they didn't give you permission. So if your village is starving, you run out of food, you literally cannot leave your village. And there was thousands and thousands of people who were turned away. They're trying to leave and they couldn't leave. And there's actually a letter by Stalin where he's saying, oh, these people are leaving the Ukrainian villages and trying to come to the city because they want to spread propaganda. Literally hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children. And he's just saying, they're spreading propaganda.
Yeah. That's
Stop them.
Yeah.
Basically that.
Wow.
And he's like, oh, they're doing it under the guise of trying to
It
get
seems like
bread.
they even turned their own villages into like de facto concentration camps by like
Basically.
having
Yeah.
these thugs just keep them there,
Wow.
starve them out. That's insane.
Can you imagine? Oh my goodness.
And they, not only, like I mentioned, there was like the nationalist aspect, or like, we're worried about these people rising up against us, but they also exploited it in so many other ways, like the food they're taking, all the grain they're taking and expropriating from the kulaks. They're selling that to Western countries to get like pounds, so now they can buy equipment from Western countries and do industrialization, because at this point, no Western countries wanted to use the rubles because they didn't trust the
Yeah.
ruble because the Soviets defaulted on all the debts that Russia had, and so we're not going to use rubles. So they needed Western money, and so they took all this stuff and sold it to the West. They're literally exporting all of this food while people are starving, just for money, just to build more factories so Stalin could feel good about himself.
That's
It blows my
terrifying.
mind that people defend it. It kind of blows my mind even more that people say that never happened. Because the people who defend it are just like, okay, we get it, you're evil. But the people who are just completely
Yeah.
ignorant to the fact that it happened or in denial about it, you're just stupid.
I really think all of this comes down to the initial journalists that were there in the Soviet Union, kind of living it up in Moscow and deciding to run with whatever propaganda the USSR wanted to
And I
to
see
send
that
to the
happen
West.
in the media today.
All the time.
Isn't that crazy?
Walter Duranty, he literally admitted, right, behind closed doors that this was happening, and just refuse to
Yeah.
print the truth.
Yeah, that kind of gives us an insight into what some of these modern people might be thinking on the
Yeah.
inside, because he's publishing these puff pieces and saying, nobody's starving in the Soviet Union. Maybe they're a little hungry. They're not starving though. And then behind closed doors, there was journalists like John Chamberlain and Louis Fisher who heard him on several occasions say, yeah, I think like 3 million people died, but you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
Oh, brother.
And I think, it's like he recognizes this is happening, and he, said he doesn't really care because it's the greater good. But, he's lying to the public because it's much harder to make that case to the public. If you're like in a room with somebody and you might say some things you might not normally say because they're right there. You can kind of have a debate and be like, oh, actually, I'm right. But you can't do that when you're publishing all these newspapers with massive amounts of people. So it's like, it's just better to lie to them.
It's better to conceal the truth. Yeah, because the truth would point people to the reality of what's happening here. Yeah, I really I think it's super important to consider also what it was like trying to be a journalist, getting into the Soviet Union and trying to uncover the truth. I know there were a few journalists that were very, very brave. There were several very brave people who infiltrated the Soviet Union and did so to spread literature. We know some of those people at FEE. There was another journalist, Gareth Jones, who infiltrated and really broke the story about what was happening to Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's unfortunately like most of the journalists that actually said something were very small journalists.
Yeah.
They didn't build a name for themselves. Like Walter Duranty, he has a Pulitzer Prize at this point. He has like this built-up
He has
legitimacy.
a Pulitzer Prize and he's lying to everybody like that.
Literal mainstream
Walter Duranty's
media.
grandson is out here writing an article for like HuffPost that's like, gas may be $8, ... Here's why that may actually be a good thing.
Imagine for a second going into North Korea and then like writing the puff piece that Kim Jong-un wants you to write after he takes you on your planned tour.
Dennis Rodman.
Like, it's like, it's just like
literally
that.
like that because the stuff he said, like his primary source was Stalin. So it's literally like going to Kim Jong-un and just taking in what he's saying.
Yeah.
And then
have you
saying
guys ever seen one of the like planned tours of North Korea?
Yeah, no,
current
like
day?
literally watch the Vice documentary where they followed Dennis Rodman and a bunch of NBA players through their planned tour of North Korea. At the end of it, Dennis is so impressed with Kim Jong-un, he like stands up at like this national basketball game between the Americans and the North Koreans, and like the entire country of North Korea is like in this stadium. He stands up and he's like, I love North Korea. Like, thank you for taking me on this wonderful tour.
My
And they really
goodness.
credited him with like improving U.S.-North Korea relations because of this, because he really kind of sucked up to Kim Jong-un. But yeah, watch it. It's really good. It's a good documentary.
Yeah, but imagine, so those journalists, Vice, obviously when they go into North Korea on this planned trip, they are going through the planned trip, but like their voiceovers after the fact talk about how weird it is.
Yeah, they definitely
the fact
pointed
that
it
it's
out.
planned. Like they talk about the reality of the situation in North Korea, and it's because we have access to information about what's going on. Imagine being a journalist for a second, and it's kind of the same situation as North Korea. You're able to go into Moscow on a planned trip. Everything is highly controlled. And they want you to write a puff piece about the Soviet Union, and you decide to escape from, your handlers, and you decide to run off into some small country towns in Ukraine. That's essentially what a few journalists did. And because we hide these stories away, they specifically are never celebrated for their bravery in those situations.
Yeah, there was a couple of Canadian journalists who got in a car and drove out and found all these empty villages where all these people starved, and they were taken and deported. And Gareth Jones is a well-known one. He got away from his tour, and he started going around Ukraine and again finding all these villages, finding all these dead bodies, and all of this hunger. And there was one story that he was on a train. It was kind of before he really started seeing everything. And he was asking a communist, "Oh, is there starvation?" He's like, "No, we're fine. We're fine." And Jones took some bread crust that he had, and he threw it off. And a man on the train went and grabbed it and started eating it. And then he did the same thing with an orange peel and threw it off, and he grabbed it and started eating it. And he's like, yeah, I don't think you're telling me the truth here. And the communist is kind of like, yeah, we're starving. Yep. So that was like him starting to find out what was happening. And then, he went around looking at villages, finding all these dead bodies, talking to people. And as a result of this, it's not 100% confirmed, but many historians believe that he was actually killed by the secret police. So it's after he left the Soviet Union, and he was actually in China. He was touring China, and he ended up being kidnapped, and then he was found shot. And there was like a lot of connections with the NKVD to his death, and so many people do believe that like as a result of him doing that, he ended up dead. And there was a lot of different mysterious deaths of like journalists who were either sympathetic or who broke stories, who just vanished into thin air or just ended up dead under mysterious circumstances.
So when you clap back at people on TikTok and like show them all these facts, have you changed people's minds, or are they usually pretty like set in their ways?
I've definitely heard people say I changed their minds. They fall into Reddit holes and YouTube holes, following the algorithm, hearing all these videos from these bread tubers like, no, Ukraine famine didn't happen, blah, 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 all this stuff. And they just become convinced by it, because I think one of the reasons is some of these younger people just want to be part of a counterculture. And if you're being told, you were actually lied to about the Soviet Union, and like you mentioned earlier, you're looking around seeing bad things happening in like the US and the US economy, and you want an alternative. And they're telling you, there was this alternative, and it was much better than people tell you. And they'll give you, like I said, these niche little facts. Sometimes they are facts, sometimes they're misleadings, sometimes they're blatant fabrications. They'll give you like convenient sources and stuff like this and be like, look. And they don't have a response to it because they don't really know about the history, and they don't really know about
because
these
these
lies.
things weren't actually taught in schools. Like we weren't genuinely taught the horrors of the Soviet Union.
So if their first time hearing about it is from like Vosh, then I guess they're just gonna believe it, right?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, Vosh isn't pro-Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
He's got a lot of other weird
Who's a bread
opinions.
tuber then?
Yeah. But there
I
are
really
genuine Marxist-Leninists on, these platforms. I tend to assume they're younger because when you're young, you tend to have very extreme, back and forth ideological swings. But, they really are like the modern propagandists. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this story is that there was a genocide happening that people still can't agree on because of propaganda. Like, it is so important for us to be able to have the freedom to speak about things truthfully. Otherwise, horrific things get swept under the rug time and time again.
And if you don't learn from history, you're literally doomed to repeat it, which is why I may sound like an alarmist, but when I see the polarization and the divide widen year after year, and it seems to be rapidly picking up now between race, between class, between immigration status, between religion, but now I feel like it's mostly between race and class, I can really foresee something horrible happening and the government trying to cover it up again.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of that quote that you said. That was Walter Duranty, right? Who said you need to break a few eggs to make an omelet, essentially. It wasn't a few eggs,
7 million eggs.
Yeah. And that is the destructiveness of like totalitarian ideologies.
That whole mindset, the whole ends to justify the means mindset, I think 99% of the time is just horrible and wrong. It can almost never be
there's
justified.
a popular meme that I see floating around, and it's, I think a communist on Twitter or something like that, and they're saying, oh yeah, if you burn a souffle, you don't say, I'm going to stop making souffles. And then someone replies to it with like a picture of like a mass grave in the Soviet Union. And they're like, oops, I burnt the souffle. And that's what it's like. They're trying to underplay all these genocides and democides and all this stuff. Like, it's that simple. Like, oh, I'm just going to do it better this time, Like,
oopsie.
I'll be better.
There is a string that runs through all of these horrific events of the 20th century, and that is totalitarian state power, right? It is like giving up all authority to the government, and it doesn't matter if it's a left-wing or right-wing ideology. It's when we abdicate, responsibility for ourselves and our lives to the state that this stuff begins to happen. And I do agree with you that I have seen a trend of people becoming more friendly and flirting with that more and more. And I do think it's because we're not talking about the consequences of authoritarianism
It's
enough.
really interesting to see the Democrats completely abandon more lower class and more impoverished rural working class white people in the red states and totally dehumanizing them. Just say Trump supporter, uneducated, poor, da-da-da-da-da. But they'll go ham. They'll act like they go to bat for poor minorities. They really don't. But that's a whole nother conversation. But they increase that divide, knowing good and well they're not doing anything to help any of us. They're not doing anything to help black people by keeping them on the welfare system, or white people by just leaving them in the Appalachia and just accusing them of being racist and just not doing anything at all to help them. And at some point, we're just going to turn against each other, and they'll be laughing and still eating good and still being pretty rich up there.
Very true. Well, I think this is a good place to wrap. I did want to give Ben one last opportunity to say any final thoughts or key takeaways he has for people specifically about the Holodomor and lessons we can learn.
Yeah, like you guys said, there's common threads that you see with like totalitarian regimes. We talked about the tours that they give, where the government officials are showing you, look, everything's fine. The Nazis did that. The Soviets did that. China does that today. North Korea does that. Just trying to cover up everything. You see a lot of anti-capitalism from all these same places. Anti-capitalism is very common because they want to take away the focus of the individual and say, no, you gotta put production towards the collective and not for like individual gain and individual profits and stuff like that. It's also, they always do it under the guise of it's for the people. We're the People's Party. In North Korea, they got the People's Party, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the workers, people, and then always the us versus them. It's the workers, the people versus the bourgeoisie versus the rich versus this ethnicity.
What happens when you eliminate the bourgeoisie, right?
You're screwed.
Yeah. What happens when you eliminate the productive people in society who actually own things that can produce things?
Then 7
you
million
are
people
screwed.
Die.
Yeah, and then suddenly you no longer have an enemy.
That's
to
what
point
happened
at.
in the Soviet Union. So like in the Soviet Union in like 1918, they started war communism, and it was nationalizing everything, total central planning, getting rid of private property, and it failed so badly that they had to reverse it and do the new economic plan or new economic policy. And that was a lot more capitalistic. It was still a lot of central planning, but
it was mixed.
Kind of like how China is today, sort of, it's a lot of capitalist elements. They had to reverse it and go back because everything was crashing
Falling
down.
apart.
They said, oops, burn the souffle, let's try again. Then they burned it real bad.
That's exactly
they
what
burned
happened.
It real
because then after the new economic policy, after Lenin died, then Stalin's like, let's go back and do the collectivization again. And he started his 5-year plans, and that's what
So
started
even
the
Stalin
Soviet
was like,
famine.
communism didn't even exist the first time. We have to do it properly. And now the little bread tubers are saying the same thing. Full circle.
What drives me crazy is that a lot of people who embrace communist ideology are so concerned about, powerful business owners and like powerful heads of corporations getting so ingrained in our daily lives. What do you think the government is? It's a corporation that you have no choice of participating with or not, right? And if you trade the government for corporations, you're essentially living under one giant totalitarian Amazon. So I don't.
And it's kind of, the government is kind of already like that. Like I believe in California, the government is already the biggest employer in the state. Isn't that ridiculous?
Gosh.
And
It's
it only
horrible.
happens to be that California is the
that's
place.
the whole country.
Is it really?
Yeah.
I know at least in
Canada,
California.
Like
it's
the military.
really bad.
Oh
you
yeah,
count-
of course. If you count the
everything,
military,
yeah.
I actually would believe that statistic.
Canada, it's the same. I think it might be
It's
a fourth or a
unsustainable.
third of jobs are
when they're
are
paying
sponsored by the
people with
government.
taxpayer money, when they're giving out healthcare with taxpayer money, like now they have the suicide program with taxpayer money in Canada. It's insane.
Yeah,
That's
should be another episode.
Honestly, we should talk about that.
I think so too. Yeah.
That may be a great place to leave off. Thank you so much, Ben. Do
Absolutely.
you want to share your TikTok and Instagram wherever people can follow you?
Yeah, it's PraxBen on all platforms pretty much, except for Instagram. There's a little dot in there, prax.ben, because someone took the thing before I could get to it.
I feel that. On Twitter, you guys can follow me at Rondeau Olivia, and Instagram, Rondeau.Olivia.
And you can follow me on Twitter at Liberty Anders. I hope you guys loved this episode as much as we loved filming it. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and hit the bell. And we will be back next week. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
Bye.